TRAORÉ'S $2.1 billion. Trade pivot just shattered America's grip on Africa.
Across Africa, a quiet revolution is reshaping the global balance of trade. From the Atlantic coast to the Sahel, new alliances are emerging, not through wars or sanctions, but through contracts, investments, and partnerships. In the heart of this transformation lies Burkina Faso, a landlocked nation once seen as peripheral to global commerce. But under the leadership of Captain Ibrahim Traoré, the country has become a symbol of a wider movement, and Africa asserting control over its own economic destiny. This is the story of Burkina Faso's bold trade pivot, how it fits into Africa's trillion-dollar trade shift, and why global powers, from Washington to Beijing, are watching closely. Burkina Faso has historically been one of the least industrialized countries in the world, yet, in recent years, its foreign trade strategy has shifted dramatically. Once tied primarily to European markets, Burkina Faso is now aligning with African and Asian partners. Trade data from the African Development Bank (AFDB) shows that between 2022 and 2025, exports to Asia have grown by more than 40%, while Western imports have declined steadily. The country's leadership views this not as a rejection of the West, but as a necessary diversification, a recalibration of economic sovereignty. At the core of this pivot is the African Continental Free Trade Area, or AFCFTA, which officially became operational in 2021. It connects 1.3 billion people across 54 countries, forming a combined GDP exceeding $3.4 trillion for nations like Burkina Faso. AFCFTA offers access to regional value chains, industrial corridors, and tariff-free zones that were once unimaginable. China's expanding role in West Africa has been decades in the making, but in 2025, it reached a new phase. Bilateral trade between China and Africa surpassed $282 billion in 2024, according to China's Ministry of Commerce, more than 15 times the figure to decades ago. For Burkina Faso, this relationship is pragmatic. After re-establishing diplomatic ties with Beijing in 2018, cooperation deepened rapidly. Chinese companies have financed roads, solar plants, hospitals, and telecommunication infrastructure. A new industrial park outside Ouagadougou, backed by joint Chinese and Burkinabé capital, aims to create over 10,000 jobs and boost exports of cotton, gold, and agricultural goods. Analysts describe this as part of a continental pivot toward multipolarity, where African nations balance relations between old Western partners and new Eastern ones. For many African leaders, including Traoré, China's offer of infrastructure for resources and a promise of non-interference is an appealing alternative to the conditional aid models of the past. In Washington, the shift has not gone unnoticed. Over the past year, U.S. officials have expressed concern over the growing influence of Beijing and Moscow in Africa's Sahel region, including Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. These are nations that have, in recent years, distanced themselves from Western military and financial frameworks, seeking instead partnerships with non-traditional allies. For American policymakers, the challenge is twofold: how to maintain access to Africa's critical minerals, and how to compete with China's deep-pocketed investments that often come without political strings. In February 2025, the U.S. Africa Strategic Trade Forum in Addis Ababa emphasized the need for mutually beneficial partnerships, a coded message that Washington aims to reset relations without ceding ground. But for many Africans, these appeals come late. The new trade corridors, through Dakar, Lagos, Addis, and Nairobi, increasingly flow eastward. Reports surfaced in early 2025 of a series of trade and investment agreements between Burkina Faso and China, valued collectively at around $0.1 billion, While officials have not confirmed a single zero-tariff pact, multiple deals under the AFCFTA and bilateral frameworks suggest a significant economic deepening. These include renewable energy projects, mining sector expansion, and an agricultural modernization fund. The symbolism, however, is what captured global attention. For many observers, these agreements mark a declaration of intent that Africa's economic partnerships are no longer monopolized by any single power. It is this symbolism, more than any single transaction, that has been described as shattering the old order. The effects of Burkina Faso's trade realignment are already rippling across West Africa. Mali and Niger, both facing their own political transitions, have also expanded cooperation with China, Russia, and Turkey. Ghana, a regional economic powerhouse, continues to play a balancing role, strengthening AFCFTA trade ties while maintaining relationships with both East and West. Together, these moves suggest an emerging West African trade bloc, one that could prioritize regional self-sufficiency over dependency. If successful, this could form one of the largest integrated markets in the developing world. Critics warn that such realignments come with risks, including overdependence on Chinese capital or opaque loan structures. But proponents argue that diversification itself is a form of empowerment, giving African governments leverage to negotiate better terms than before. Africa's strength lies in its scale. With 1.3 billion consumers and a median age of just 19, the continent represents not only the world's youngest workforce, but also one of its fastest-growing middle classes. By 2030, Africa's consumer spending is projected to surpass $2.5 trillion. This demographic momentum, coupled with digital transformation, makes Africa the next great frontier for global commerce. From fintech startups in Lagos to green energy ventures in Nairobi, innovation is driving a new narrative, one that no longer defines Africa by its dependency, but by its potential. Burkina Faso's leadership sees its trade pivot not as isolationism, but participation in a truly African-centered globalization. In Ouagadougou's markets, traders speak with cautious optimism. "We used to import everything," says one merchant. "Now, we're finding regional suppliers, and prices are better." A young entrepreneur adds, "Partnerships with Asia mean technology transfer. We're not just exporting raw materials anymore, we're building capacity," but not everyone is convinced. An economist at the University of Bobo-Dioulasso warns, China's loans can be a double-edged sword. If not managed properly, they can recreate dependency in a different form. Such perspectives underline the complexity of Africa's transformation, progress laced with caution. Inside Washington's policy circles, Burkina Faso's economic realignment triggered quiet reflection rather than open panic. A decade ago, U.S. trade with sub-Saharan Africa exceeded $100 billion. By 2024, it had fallen below $60 billion. Meanwhile, Chinese and intra-African trade surged past $280 billion and continued climbing. At the 2025 U.S. Africa Business Forum in Addis Ababa, American delegates spoke of renewed partnership built on mutual respect, but beyond the rhetoric lay a recognition that the rules of engagement had changed. Africa was no longer a peripheral market, it was a strategic hub for energy, food security, and digital innovation. Think tank reports urged Washington to compete not through pressure, but through technology transfer, green investment, and education exchange. Whether those recommendations will become policy remains uncertain. Across the Sahel, governments confront a delicate equation: security, sovereignty, and survival. Mali and Niger, having withdrawn from ECOWAS in 2024, rely increasingly on bilateral deals with Asia and the Middle East. Burkina Faso, though still engaging regional partners, positions itself as a bridge, leveraging AFCFTA corridors that run through Ghana and Togo. In Ouagadougou, ministers insist this is not a rejection of ECOWAS, but a correction of dependence. By 2025, Intra-African exports had risen by 20% under AFCFTA rules, and Sahelian states sought to anchor themselves within that growth. Still, instability lingers. Security spending consumes as much as 15% of national budgets. Without peace, trade corridors remain vulnerable, a reminder that economic progress in the Sahel is inseparable from stability. For Europe, Africa's new assertiveness presents both opportunity and challenge. The European Union remains Africa's largest single trading partner, yet its share is shrinking. EU commissioners in Brussels now speak of equal partnerships and co-development. France, historically influential in West Africa, faces growing skepticism. Burkina Faso expelled French troops in 2023. Since then, cultural and economic ties have cooled. Yet European firms quietly adapt, investing in renewable energy, logistics, and digital sectors aligned with AFCFTA's vision. Observers say Europe's future influence depends on whether it can treat Africa a co-architect of global policy rather than a beneficiary of aid. China's approach continues to blend commerce with diplomacy. In 2025, Beijing pledged another $60 billion in financing for African industrial zones and green energy corridors. Critics label this debt diplomacy. Supporters see infrastructure without lectures. For Burkina Faso, the benefits are visible: new highways, transmission lines, and an agri-processing park scheduled to open by 2026. However, economists caution that the long-term success of such projects depends on local value addition and transparent governance. China's goal, analysts say, is not to replace the West, but to embed itself in Africa's growth story, a partnership framed as South-South cooperation. The data reveal the magnitude of Africa's transformation. Total African GDP 2025 approximately equals $3.5 trillion. Projected 2030 GDP approximately equals $4.8 trillion. Top intra-African trade corridors: Lagos-Abidjan, Mombasa-Kigali, Durban-Lusaka. African population under 25 approximately equals 60%. The AFCFTA Secretariat estimates the agreement could boost intra-African trade by 50% by 2035 if fully implemented. Burkina Faso, though small in absolute GDP, sits strategically between coastal and Sahel routes. Its trade reforms, simplifying customs, investing in rail links, digitalizing export permits, serve as a model for landlocked nations seeking integration. At ground level, the transformation takes human form. A cooperative in Kudugu now exports organic cotton shirts to Kenya tariff-free under AFCFTA rules. A women-led agritech startup uses Chinese-built solar pumps to irrigate sorghum fields. University graduates, once eyeing migration to Europe, are launching logistics firms, linking Ouagadougou to Accra. Not every story is triumphant. Electricity shortages persist, and bureaucracy remains a hurdle, yet the sense of possibility is palpable. We are finally trading with each other, not just with the world, says a young exporter. Beyond roads and ports, a new kind of infrastructure binds the continent: digital connectivity. Under the Smart Africa Alliance, nations coordinate data regulation, cybersecurity, and e-commerce policies. By 2025, Africa hosts 5 of the world's fastest-growing fintech hubs. Burkina Faso's central bank recently launched an interoperable mobile payments, which linking it to neighbors, cutting transaction costs by 40%. Digital trade may soon surpass traditional exports as Africa's primary growth engine. Commodity traders monitor Africa's new alignment with close attention. Gold, lithium, and rare earth supplies from West Africa increasingly flow to Asia. Investors in New York and London recalibrate portfolios, seeking exposure to AFCFTA-driven growth. The IMF projects sub-Saharan Africa's collective growth at 4.3% for 2025, outpacing the global average. But growth without governance can invite risk. Corruption, debt, and inequality remain persistent challenges. trade cannot thrive without security. Burkina Faso's government continues to battle extremist insurgencies in its northern provinces. Regional initiatives, the Accra Initiative and African Union peace missions, aim to stabilize border zones so that economic corridors can function. The success of Africa's trade pivot may ultimately hinge not on trade agreements, but on the ability to keep routes safe and communities secure. 60% of Africans are under 25. This generation will inherit the consequences and opportunities of today's realignments. Across the continent, youth movements demand transparency, innovation, and sustainability. They see trade not as ideology, but as access to knowledge, jobs, and global networks. For them, Burkina Faso's pivot is part of a larger awakening, an Africa that negotiates from strength, not from need. The next 5 years will test whether Africa's trade renaissance endures. If AFCFTA achieves full implementation, tariffs could drop on 90% of goods, unlocking supply chains worth hundreds of billions. If debt remains manageable and governance strengthens, Africa could become the world's next manufacturing frontier. But missteps could reverse progress. Opaque deals, unsustainable loans, or renewed conflict could erode gains. History offers lessons, yet this generation appears determined to write a different chapter. In the story of global trade, Africa is no longer a footnote, it is a force. Burkina Faso's pivot symbolizes a wider continental confidence, the belief that partnership, not dependency, defines prosperity. The world watches, some with skepticism, others with admiration, as Africa redraws the map of power and possibility. And as the trains roll across the Sahel and the ports hum on distant coasts, one truth becomes clear. The century ahead will be written not about Africa, but with Africa,